So where were we? Ah yes, the Western Front in a deadlock, the Eastern Front having decisive battles, and the Balkans being in chaos, as usual. But this war wasn't done growing, it was about to go global. In late August of 1914, Japan declared war on Germany. Though not out of some deep moral conviction to save the Belgians, it was just an excellent excuse to seize the German colonies in East Asia and in the Pacific. Next we have the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire. Despite being in a state of decline, the Ottomans decided to roll the dice and join the Central Powers in late October 1914. With a mix of promises, a little pressure, and two shiny German warships, Göben and Breslau, that showed up and made the Ottomans feel like they could too be a great power again. The Ottomans wasted no time bombarding the Russian ports in the Black Sea and sparking a war with Russia. The decision wasn't exactly popular at home, but the leadership was betting this alliance could help restore the fading empire. Spoiler alert, it wouldn't. Meanwhile, Italy was having a bit of an existential crisis. Although technically allied with the Germans and the Austrians prior to the war, Italy decided to sit out in 1914, claiming the Central Powers had started an offensive war. But Britain and France weren't about to let Italy stay neutral forever. They made huge promises to the Italians in the Treaty of London, promising both territory and influence. In May 1915, Italy officially switched sides, declared war on Austria, and opened up a new front in the Alps. Fighting in the Alps was brutal. Snow, cliffs, and avalanches took scores of men, and over the next few years the Italian front became a stalemate just like in France. Both sides attempted impossible offensives that at best took a few miles of ground. While the Ottoman Empire may have looked fragile, they weren't going down without a fight. The Allies had their eyes on two key objectives in 1915. Breaking through the Ottoman defenses to open up a supply route to Russia, and ideally knocking the Ottomans out of the war entirely. The centerpiece of this plan was Gallipoli, a bold but ultimately disastrous campaign to seize control of the Dardanelles Strait. On April 25, 1915, Allied forces including the British, French, and Anzac forces launched amphibious landings on the Gallipoli Peninsula, but the Ottomans, led by Mustafa Kemal, were more than prepared. Like in France, Gallipoli quickly devolved into a nightmare. Poor planning, rugged terrain, and stiff Ottoman resistance turned the campaign into a grueling stalemate. By the end of 1915, the Allies decided to call it quits, retreating with over 250,000 casualties. Meanwhile, in Mesopotamia, the British forces launched a campaign to secure the region's vital oil fields and waterways. Early victories gave the Allies hope, but then came Kut al-Amara. After a long siege in April 1916, the British garrison at Kut surrendered to the Ottomans in one of the most humiliating defeats of the war. It was a wake-up call though for the Allies. Fighting the Ottomans wasn't going to be easy. That's not to say the Ottoman Empire didn't try a few offensives of its own. In early 1915, the Ottomans tried to cross the Suez Canal but failed miserably. In response, the Ottoman government carried out the Armenian genocide. The Ottomans mass deported and killed millions of the Armenian ethnic population, leading to over 1 million deaths. It remains one of the darkest chapters of the war and a grim reminder of its far-reaching consequences. Lastly, Bulgaria, the Central Powers' last addition to the alliance. Bulgaria was still feeling quite salty after getting its ass handed to it in the Second Balkan War. When the Prussia of the Balkans was offered a chance to pounce on their Serbian rival, they took it, which allowed Austria-Hungary to finally defeat the Serbians. If 1915 was the year the war expanded, then 1916 was the year it devolved into one thing: attrition. Both sides stopped trying to win the war outright with decisive victories and started to try to bleed each other dry. And nowhere was this clearer than at Verdun and the Somme. On February the 21st, 1916, German artillery fire screeched into the fortress city of Verdun. The Germans weren't necessarily trying to capture the city, but were hoping to launch a battle that was so deadly and costly for the French forces that they'd be completely neutered from launching any further offensives. The French under General Philippe Pétain dug in and fought back with everything they had, adopting the famous motto, "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass. For 300 days, both sides exchanged artillery barrages and human waves of attacks, resulting in over 700,000 casualties. By December, Verdun still stood, but at a horrific cost. To relieve some pressure off the French at Verdun, the British launched their own offensive on the Somme River in July 1916. This was a disaster though. The British suffered nearly 60,000 casualties on just the first day, making it the worst day in British military history. In the east, Russia was about to pull one of its greatest moves of the war, the Brusilov offensive. Starting on the 4th of June 1916, General Alexei Brusilov launched a massive assault against Austria-Hungary. Unlike the usual send waves of men to their death strategy, Brusilov decided to use something a bit more civilized and novel. Surprise and coordination. Artillery was focused on specific weak points in the Austro-Hungarian formations, and his troops advanced swiftly before the enemy could recover. The result was a total disaster for Austria-Hungary. By September, they had lost over 400,000 men. This forced Germany to divert troops from the Western Front to the east, putting even more of a strain on their already overstretched forces. Despite Brusilov's gains, Russia could not capitalize on his success. Supply shortages, exhaustion, and pessimism in the Russian ranks forced Brusilov to halt the offensive. A follow-up counteroffensive by the Germans and Austro-Hungarians pushed him almost completely out of Galicia. Romania also tried to capitalize off of Brusilov's successes but failed miserably. In 1917, Russia reached its breaking point. Years of military defeats, famine, political unrest, and astronomically high military casualties led to the February Revolution. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated on March the 15th, and a provisional government was set up and tried to keep the war effort alive. But the Russian army was not having it. Desertion skyrocketed, morale hit its rock bottom, and by November, the Bolsheviks led by Lenin promised peace, land, and bread for the people. They overthrew the government in the October Revolution, and their first order of business was to end the war. In March of 1918, Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, exiting the war and handing over a huge chunk of territory to the Central Powers. The Germans were thrilled. They can now focus all of their efforts on the Western Front. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare was pushing the US closer to war. Then came the Zimmermann telegram in January of 1917, a German proposal for Mexico to attack the United States in exchange for land, and that did not go very well. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. American troops wouldn't arrive in large numbers until 1918, but their entry was a game changer, tipping the balance decisively in the Allies' favor. Lasting from summer of 1917 to the winter, the Allies tried to break through the German lines at Passchendaele, but it was completely futile and thousands of men died just for a few miles of mud. As the winter drew to a close and American troops were arriving en masse in 1918, Germany launched the spring offensive in March, hoping to knock out the Allies before even more American reinforcements could arrive. It was ambitious and initially successful. German troops advanced further than they had since 1914. But success came at a huge cost. Germany exhausted its reserves, whilst the Allies, now bolstered by fresh American troops, launched the 100 Days Offensive in August of 1918. They broke through the German lines and pushed them back relentlessly. Whilst Germany was suffering these defeats, the other Central Powers were falling apart too. The Ottoman Empire was defeated in the Middle East, with the British-led forces capturing Damascus in October of 1918. In the Balkans, the Allied offensives launched from Greece forced Bulgaria to surrender in September. Austria-Hungary followed suit and dissolved into chaos shortly after. In Germany, people were fed up with not eating due to the British naval blockade. Socialist revolutions were brewing in the south, and the German naval mutiny forced Kaiser Wilhelm II to abdicate on the 9th of November 1918. Just 2 days later, on the 11th, an armistice was signed, officially ending the war. The Great War was finally over, but its impact would linger. Empires had fallen, borders were redrawn, and the world was left with scars, both physical and emotional. As the dust settled, leaders gathered at Versailles to draft a peace treaty, but as we all know, that peace wouldn't last very long.